Okay, let's
In
go
addition
on.
to claiming these products were safe, the biotech industry claimed they would increase yield.
Advances in biotechnology can help us produce more food on land we already cultivate or on land that's currently unsuitable for farming.
Monsanto submitted a regulatory package to both the FDA and the EPA for Roundup Ready soybeans, the first really big commercial crop. It's really very curious, how shallow actually the science was. They didn't look at routine stresses, drought, plant pathogens, other things that, soybean plants deal with in the environment. In the year 2000, a team of scientists based at the University of Arkansas documented decreases in the size of the root system, and under droughty conditions, these reductions were 25%. Now that 25% impairment is going to translate into several bushels of lost yield in any part of the world. It's a very big impact. The other gap in the regulatory reviews was that no one bothered to explore the impact of the spraying of Roundup over the top of soybean plants on the capacity of the soybean plant to affix nitrogen. And it's one of the most important environmental benefits of soybeans. It's a legume, like peas, so you don't have to put nitrogen fertilizer in your garden when you're growing peas or soybeans. And we're only now starting to study this because farmers have observed problems in some fields with Roundup Ready soybeans. I mean, they just did terrible and couldn't explain why.
One of the biggest threats to yield comes from superweeds, weeds that have become resistant to herbicides like Roundup. In 2003, mare's tail, a superweed, spread into 21 states. Now farmers have to use dangerous chemicals such as 2,4-D, which is similar to Agent Orange and has been proven to cause birth defects. Instead of spraying less, they are spraying more.
So the whole thing of testing, they were not tested. They always say these have been tested more than any crops in history, but when you really look at what they've been tested for, it's not for health. It's not for health for animals, it's not for health for people, it's do they grow? Do they grow, do they do this or that? They're patented, so scientists aren't allowed to use them for testing without permission from Monsanto. So this is the testing that's been done. The corporations do the testing, they summarize the results, and they hand them into the government, and the government says, we see they've done the testing. So it's not really testing. But what's happened now all over the world in the past 15 years, especially in the last 5 years, there have been more and more tests being done. And they found all kinds of problems with GMO. They found immune system problems, liver, kidney, all kinds of things. So this is the superweeds. This is the increase in resistance to glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup. Obviously, huge increase in that. And so because of that, they approved a new GMO that was made up of 2,4-D and other chemicals that was part of Agent Orange. And they brought that out, and then because of lawsuits, they pulled it back. So now it's not being used. It's not allowed to be used yet till they reconsider it. So they're spraying more. There are more resistant seeds. Here's the BT-resistant insects across the globe. They engineer BT into the crops, actually a different form of BT than the BT that organic farmers spray on their crops. Every single cell creates it. And the way that nature works is it develops resistance. There'll be one insect or one weed that'll be resistant to Roundup or to BT, and then that will take over, and then you have a big mess. And this is the amount of glyphosate that's been applied in soy and per pound, glyphosate per pound, glyphosate pounds per. So they say GMOs will result in using fewer chemicals, but since they're designed to be sprayed with a chemical, obviously that's How can that possibly be true, right? So, let's see. This is the use of glyphosate. It's gone up. So it has it in kilograms and in pounds. It's vastly increased. So 56,000 pounds, I guess 5 million. Now it's 825 million pounds. A lot more. Okay, that's the good news for this slide. And of course, I'm sure you've all realized that they've found a lot of problems with Roundup and glyphosate. It's been declared a probable carcinogen, at the least. And it's found in most people's urine. They've done a study, I think it's called the glyphosate study. And they tested the urine of a whole cross-section of society, and everyone had it in their urine, including a friend of mine who only eats organic. So what effect does that have on us? I mean, why have the health problems in the United States increased so much since the mid-90s, since this has come out? It's been a huge increase in health problems. The promoters of GMO say because that's when organic food became popular too. So maybe that's because we're all eating more organic food. They really do think people are stupid, you know? They really do. They're like, we're the authority, believe us. So I'm going to skip through this next one because this is how they got approved.
But how did this controversial new technology get approved by the government in the first place?
It's so
At the end of the first Bush administration, George Bush's administration, Dan Quayle ran something called the Competitiveness Council.
We will ensure that biotech products will receive the same oversight as other products, instead of being hampered by unnecessary regulation.
What Quayle's council recommended is that there be no regulation at all for these foods. This outraged FDA scientists. There is voluminous documentation showing that FDA scientists said this food needs to be tested. This food can be toxic. This food can create new allergens. The genetic engineering process, the cell invasion technique that is genetic engineering, can lower nutrition. It can create immune problems in laboratory animals. All these things need to be tested, much less the environmental effects. But Dan Quayle and his council said, no way. We want to be the first in the world to market this food. FDA still said no. So what do? They brought in a deputy commissioner for food policy, a man named Michael Taylor. And Michael Taylor used to work at King & Spalding as Monsanto's senior counsel there. He had written up the industry regulations, which were basically no regulations, and of course, he allowed this no regulation policy to become official U.S. policy in 1992.
Monsanto employees and government regulatory agency employees are the same people. And to give you one example, there's countless names on this list, but one that kind of stands out to me, the biggest, is Linda Fisher. Linda Fisher, for the past 7 years, has been an executive vice president for Monsanto Corporation. She is now the deputy administrator for the EPA, also as a deputy administrator under George Bush Sr.'s administration. Prior to that, she was with Monsanto. And prior to that, she was with the EPA. She's been back and forth 3 times. And the list goes on and on like that in Washington. I have written a letter to our Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and I begged him for help with this monumental crisis that farmers are facing and we're facing. His response was that it is not their policy to get involved in private litigation matters. I have since learned that Mr. John Ashcroft has submitted a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court regarding a similar patent infringement case to be heard in October. He preyed upon the Supreme Court to uphold these new plant patents to protect the corporations that own the patents. Upon learning this, I also learned that Mr. Ashcroft had received the largest campaign contribution that Monsanto gave any 2000 political candidate in his failed bid for Senate re-election.
Deregulate, which is basically telling from the executive branch everybody to look the other way.
Companies now do testing themselves and report their findings to the government. The process is voluntary.
If we started really asking the right questions, we would stop this technology for the next 50 or 100 years.
But just the opposite has happened. In the US alone, genetically modified canola, corn, cotton, and soybeans, which were non-existent in the 1980s, were grown on 3.7 million acres in 1996. That jumped to 100 million acres in 2003.
So a little bit later we'll get into where they're grown all over the world now. But it's the same thing now. Michael Taylor, who we talked about, he was back in the Obama administration. So Monsanto is very powerfully connected to our government. You know, what are you going to do? But I think that this whole food movement and people moving away from genetically engineered crops, it's really bottom up. But we need both. We need bottom up and we need top down. Because if they approve more and more genetically engineered crops, which they haven't, because of resistance, because people have said, no, there's no GE rice, there's no GE wheat, they haven't done that because when they let those out, the companies say we can have coexistence. But there won't be coexistence because if you grow GE corn next to non-GE corn, it will contaminate. So they basically want to push everybody out. But they haven't done that because there's been resistance, and that's important.